Okay, well, welcome to this talk on the Dance of Death. I'm going to start off with a content warning. And this is really, really unusual for me because usually whenever I do a talk, my content warning is about human remains. And today there is going to be a lot of skeletons in it, but they're all just going to be illustrations, not real human remains. The content warning I do want to give people, I mean, obviously we're talking about the Dance of Death. So we're going to be talking about death a lot. I mean, you know, if you came along and had different expectations, I'm really intrigued as to what you were wanting. But the thing that I do want to mention is that I am going to be talking just a wee bit about child death. So I'll mention it before I'm going to start, and it's just going to be a couple of minutes. But if that's not something you're comfortable with, you might want to go and get yourself a cup of tea at that point. And I want to start off as well by saying that I am not an art historian or a medieval historian. I'm just someone who really likes skeletons. I am an anatomist by trade. So this is the kind of point of view that I'm coming at this from. But I want to start off by talking about my first real introduction to the Dance of Death. And this is something that, you know, I think there's a few people here who actually know me that some people might not know about me. And that's the fact that before I was Human Remains Conservator at Surgeons Hall, I worked at the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow. And I know there are a lot of academics here, so you're going to understand the fact that I spent a lot of time doing work on a sort of grant basis that would just be a couple of days a week. So I was spending a lot of time having to do other jobs. So I would be working at the Hunterian Museum a couple of days a week, and I did things like body piercing. I DJ'd, including at fetish nights. I modeled for art classes. Possibly the darkest period is that I did some finance work. But one of the other things I did was work at Roslyn Chapel. I was a tour guide there for a couple of years, which was a very, very nice thing to do. It's a really, really lovely place to go a couple of days a week. And if you don't know Roslyn Chapel, it's a 15th century family church that has a lot of carvings in it. It became very famous because of the Da Vinci Code. We won't say any more about that. But one of the things it does have is this archway with a series of figures representing the Dance of Death. And it's really hard to photograph this so you can actually see what's going on. But you can see there are these little squares, each with two figures, one of whom is a skeleton, and the other of whom is a living person, very soon not to be living. And they range up from, you know, the peasants all the way up to at the top. You can make out a figure with a crown on. This is a king or a pope. So this is showing us that death comes to everyone, from the lowest right up to the very highest. And this is the theme of the Dance of Death. And a couple of the other things you'll see in Roslyn Chapel are this. Roslyn Chapel is very famous for its green men. So these floreate heads with leaves and ivy and vines coming out of the mouth. And here we've got a skull with vines coming out of its mouth. So it seems to be showing that death is even coming to the green man. It's also got this amazing stone called the King of Terrors, which is a bit later than the chapel. It's 17th century, but here we've got a figure with a scythe, and it's got the words in Latin, all is equal in death. So this is the very theme that we're going to be looking at today with the Danse Macabre, the idea that death is the great leveler. And I've called this talk, Will You Join the Dance? I'm sure the Romancing the Gothic audience are going to get where that reference is coming from. It's Alice in Wonderland. So will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? The Mock Turtles song. And that's the thing about the Dance of Death. There is no will you, won't you. We are all going to die eventually. This is something that is going to happen to everyone. So death is not really offering us the option in his dance. But it's got a lot of names: the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, the Totentanz, la Danse de la Muerte. And it's something different to other anthropomorphizations of death. So we can see here, this is death depicted with the scythe. So this is personifying death. And this is something that's gone on for a long time. But in medieval Western European art, you really start to get this idea of death as a skeletal figure, often with this scythe, though the term Grim Reaper doesn't come along until the 19th century. The first mention seems to be in this book, which was translated into English as The Circle of Life. All know full well that life cannot last above 70 or at most 80 years. Again, possibly dubious these days. If we reach that term without meeting the Grim Reaper with his scythe, there or thereabout, meeting we surely shall. So this is the first mention of the Grim Reaper. And this is a bit different to things that we'd seen before this. So this is from Pompeii, and it's a cup which has got lots of skeletons almost in a dance. They're definitely having a bit of a party there. But this is more a memento mori, reminding us that we will die and to seize the day, than the idea of personifying death that we see in the medieval period. But the Dance of Death was something a bit different. The first visual appearance is here, the Cimetière de Saint-Innocence. And if any of you were at my Ossuary talk that I did for Sam a couple of years ago now, this was the first place that I mentioned in that too. This was an overcrowded burial ground in Paris, where the graves would get recycled, the bones would be dug up, and they'd be put in charnels along the walls. And this is something that had been going on for a long time. And this was a place where people would come, you know, they would go for walks there. There would be stalls, there would be preachers. And between August 1424 and Easter 1425, somebody, we don't know who, painted a mural along the wall of the charnel house, and you can just about see it in this illustration of a dance of death, of this series of figures being led away by representations of death as a skeleton. And this is the first visual motif of this that we see. Unfortunately, we can no longer see this mural because it was demolished in 1669 because the road behind it was getting widened. We do get an idea of what it looks like though, because in 1485, a printer called Guy Marchand published a printed version. So this is the printed Le Danse Macabre du Vel by Guy Marchand. And you can even see the architectural elements that have been included here. And here we can see death as a skeletal figure. He's not quite a skeleton. There's still some flesh there. On this one, we can see the sort of the opening into the abdomen. So it's not a full skeleton. And they're leading off the abbot and the bailiff in this instance. Now, Guy Marchand's printed version was really, really, really popular. Didn't include any women. So in 1486, he starts to add some women. You get a Danse Macabre of women. Only 2 of them are illustrated in 1486, and it takes another few years before you get a fully illustrated version. So here is the women's dance, and he seems to have had a little bit of difficulty trying to get enough women archetypes to put in there. So, you know, you've got women who are defined by what their husbands did. So you've got a queen, and you've got a duchess, you've got the knight's wife, and then people who are defined by their marital status, you know, a newlywed and a bride and a sweet wife. There's a spinster and an old woman and a woman with crutches. And then at the end, you get the bigoted woman and the fool. And eventually the number of in the women's dance increases until you get 36 women. And it's copied a lot. So this is a version, this is a really beautiful in the Bibliothèque Nationale Française, where you can actually go in and turn the pages of this book, and it's gorgeous. I would definitely recommend doing it. And here you can see death leading off the witch, obviously, because that is one of the things that women do. So this is the Danse Macabre, and some scholars have suggested that this is adapting an earlier form, that this is coming from plays that would be carried out showing conversations between death and the people that he was coming to collect, and that this again may have developed from Indian and Arabic poetry. And there's an intriguing tale that is said to have taken place not far from here in Jedburgh in southern Scotland, which was the wedding of King Alexander III to Yolande de Dreux in Jedburgh in 1285. There is a musical procession at the wedding, which suddenly stops when a phantom-like figure appears and moves between the dancers, and then disappears. And to add to the intrigue, a couple of months later, the king dies. There's also a poem from 1194 by a monk called Helena de Fourmont called the Vers sur le Mort. And this is 50 stanzas where a personified death goes to visit a whole range of different people, not to lead them to their mortal end, but to convince them that they should leave their worldly existence and go and retreat to a monastery. So I've seen a lot of things which will relate the Danse Macabre directly, as if there's absolutely no other cause, to the Black Death, which took place in the middle of the 14th century. And the estimates of how many people died are huge, between 75 and 200 million people in Europe. So death would certainly be on people's minds at this point. But there's a whole lot more going on than just the Black Death. You've got the 100 Years' War, which lasted more than 100 years. You've got crop failures. And as you've seen, we've also got these other depictions of death and conversations. And we can see other tropes that were around at that time. So this is the 3 living and the 3 dead. And this is the L'Île Salter, which is from the beginning of the 14th century. So it predates the Black Death. And is also just the most famous version of an older tradition in England and France. And the basic story of the 3 living, the 3 dead is that there are hunters, 3 hunters, and obviously 3 has got Christian significance, and it's also been suggested to represent power and beauty and wisdom. And these 3 hunters are out there and they meet 3 corpses who are in varying states of decay, but are still somehow animate. And the corpses admonish the living people, telling them that they have to think about what's going to happen to them. You know, what we are now, you will be. What you are now, we once were. And we can see these conversations which are depicted in the L'Île Salter. So we can see here, such shall you be, for God's love be worn by me. And the 3rd corpse, I was the chief of my lineage. Princes, kings, and constables, fair and rich, enjoyed my tables, but now I am hideous and naked, that even the worms scorn me. And if you heard my all-through talk, you get the same kind of ideas repeated in Ostries, that, you know, these are places to remind you that this is what you're going to end up as, and that they're appropriate places to contemplate purgatory. You've also got, from the same period, you've got transy tombs or cadaver tombs. And these are tombs which are showing the person, and they were usually commissioned while the person was still alive, as naked, apart from, you know, the shroud covering their genitals to preserve their modesty, in a state of decay, or being recently deceased. And some of them are more explicit than others. Some of them you see the worms sort of crawling around, insects and things like that. This one is possibly the first, and it's in Avignon, and it's from Jean de Lagrange, who died in 1402. And like that Roman memento mori that I showed you earlier, these aren't personifying death, but they're definitely trying to show us death as the great leveler. That this is to remind us that this is what's going to happen to us. And I think they often get portrayed as a way of showing the higher ups that, you know, they have to forsake their worldly possessions, and, you know, that they don't matter. You know, what you did in life is not that important. You know, if, you know, whether you're wealthy or things like that, it's living a good life that's important. But I think with all of these, you can see that they're not making wealthy people give up their worldly goods. They may encourage a bit more alms giving, you know, maybe a few more endowments, but they're certainly not making people, you know, run away and go to a monastery in most cases. And I think you can really see that with these transy tombs, because you know, while they're trying to show people as debased, and as I said, they were usually commissioned by the person while they were still alive. These cost quite a lot of money. So while you're showing yourself as debased, this is not really humility. You know, this is the worst kind of humble brag. So I think that really what they're doing is trying to keep the lower ranks in place, going, look, it doesn't matter what they have because you're all going to end up the same. So, you know, just keep quiet and get on with things. Though possibly that's my 21st century cynicism kicking in. But certainly, I think part of the popularity and prevalence of images of the Dance of Death would come to be because they were showing the fate of the high and mighty, and you know, the lower ranks of people quite like that. And as you go on, images of the three living and the dead become a bit more threatening. So here we've got three living and three dead, but those dead are definitely in pursuit of the living. They're definitely chasing them down and hunting them. So I think this is when you start to get a conflation between the three living and three dead and the dance of death, you know, that death is coming for you. So this is the context in which the Danse Macabre began. I just want to show a few examples. We have lost a lot of these over time, or they've faded. So this is one which is in the Abbé de Chaise-Dieu, which is in France, just kind of west of Lyon. And you've got 23 figures across 3 panels. It's from 1470. And again, it goes across the columns. It's really quite lovely. You get depictions in the Book of Hours. So again, these pictures aren't great, but you know, showing various people being led away by death. The very first one that took place after that one in Paris was actually in London, in Old St. Paul's. And John Lydgate, a monk, went there sometime between 1426 and 1431, and he saw the Danse Macabre in Paris. He translated the verse that was on it and brought it back, and we get a version in London. Again, that's one that hasn't survived. Roslyn Chapel was completed in 1446, and a lot of the stonemasons who worked on the chapel were thought to be French, that to have been brought over especially from France, and so they're likely to have brought this idea with them. And again, this is clearly a physician, because physicians in the 15th century primarily did their job by looking at urine. I think it was Paracelsus who says all they do is gaze at piss. And the sign of a physician at this time was the urine flask. So we can see the physician holding up the urine flask to examine it while death helps him. This is one not very far away again. This is in Hexham. And we've got 4 figures here. They're meant to be a cardinal, a king, an emperor, and a pope. And we've got the, you know, the various skeletons. These ones seem to have been defaced somehow, and that's a thing that in Britain, the Reformation destroyed many of these dances of death, and some of the ones we see in Britain are ones that have been since uncovered. And the guide in Hexham Abbey did say that these ones would have been saved because these were the rich people, and these would be trying to protect them. I like to think that maybe it was because, as I said, that the poorer people were liking to see death coming for these people rather than for themselves. For whatever reason, these 4 people were preserved. There's also this figure. I'm going to admit that even when you see this in person, you can't see much in the photo. It's not much better when you see it in person. You've really got to use a little bit of, you know, sort of your imagination. But it's been suggested that this is the caller, the person who is dictating the dance. You know, like, obviously I'm in Scotland, that if you're at Cayley, this would be the person who was telling you that you've got to take 2 steps forward and strip the willow. And so this was described, the fact that there was a caller on this dance was described in 1795, but it went missing. And this panel was found tucked behind a pew in 2017. So it's about to undergo some conservation work to see if you can really make out what's going on there. This is one that you can see in Tallinn, and this is the only medieval canvas Danse Macabre which has survived, and this is only a fragment. This fragment is 7.5 meters long, so it's big, but it was originally 30 meters long, and it's really very beautiful. It was committed. It was done in the late 15th century by Bertnotke. We can see here, this is his figure of the Pope, and he was actually copying an earlier work that he did, a mural that was done in Lübeck in Germany, which unfortunately again was lost. This was destroyed in bombing during World War II. And then this, I mean, in stained glass, I mean, the colors in this are just glorious, aren't they? It's very, very beautiful. And this whole window showing the Danse Macabre. And these are just a few examples of the very, very, very many different versions of the Dance of Death, which sprung up in the 15th and 16th centuries. One which I visited where you get a slightly different story is in northern Brittany, where the figure who's dancing, who's leading the living away, is not Death himself, but an assistant. So the skeletal figure here is thought to be Anku, who is a graveyard watcher and harvester of souls. And this is in the folklore of northeast France, Cornwall, and Wales. And I believe, I'm not a Welsh speaker, in Welsh, Anku is the word for death. Any Welsh people here might be able to confirm that for me. Anku was an assistant of death, and he often appeared as a skeleton with a cloak and a scythe. And in Brittany, each village would have its own Anku, and Anku was meant to be the last person who died in the year. They would become the Anku for the following year. And he has a rickety cart which is drawn by 2 fearsome black horses, which carries the souls that he collects. And there's many stories about where Anku came from. Some people say he was a tyrant prince who met death while he was hunting. And in a moment of hubris, he challenges death to see who can kill a stag first, because obviously that's going to end well, isn't it? Of course, death wins, and the prince was cursed with the task of rounding up the dead. Sometimes Anku is Cain, the eldest son of Adam and Eve, who was killed by his brother and condemned to restlessly wander the earth, marked by God. And the Bretons refer to the hoot of the owl as the sound of Labusan Anku, the death bird. And there's one tale of Anku in a folk song, which was collected in the 19th century. And again, this has 3 young men who are out one night and they're returning home. And they see a gaunt man driving a decrepit black cart. Warning bells? 2 of the men start to throw rocks at the cart, and it breaks the axle, and they run off. But one of the young men stays to help the elderly gentleman, and they form a makeshift axle out of a branch and his shoelaces. And the next morning, the 2 vandals are dead, and the helpful young man has completely white hair and will never speak of what happened that night. So we can see that this idea of the Danse Macabre can kind of fit itself around the local folklore, that it's not just one thing. But possibly the most famous of these Dance of Deaths was done by Hans Holbein. Oh, and this is another one. This is in Slovenia, and I think this has got something similar to the Anku story. These are quite sedate. This isn't really a dance. This is more like an orderly cue. And they're leading up to this figure on a crown at the end who's holding open a grave. And I kind of think it's like these are the helper deaths who are leading the people up to the main death. But Hans Holbein, he's most famous for this picture of Henry VIII. But before he got involved in the Tudor court, he was living in Switzerland, in Basel. And Basel was a place which had 2 very, very famous Dance of Death murals. So it would be a theme that was well known to him. And he starts to do his own Danse Macabre. And this isn't a commission, which is very unusual for artists of the time. This was something he was doing basically according to his own whim. So he wasn't trying to please anyone. So he managed to get a lot of satirical elements into it that you might not have got if this was produced for somebody. And so his Danse Macabre starts off with an expulsion from paradise. And at the expulsion from paradise, what you get is death. And this is the time of the Reformation. And one of the other things that Holbein did while he was in Basel was do the frontispiece for Martin Luther's Bible. But you can see here the kind of Reformation ideas that are creeping in. So here we've got the monk, you know, because obviously this is a point when everyone's thinking about the corruption of the established Catholic Church. So what we have is this death who's tugging on the monk. He surprised him. And the monk is desperately trying to hide his alms box. And this is the thing, with Holbein's Danse Macabre, rather than these murals and the frescoes, you're really getting a lot more detail in the images. You're just getting two people, each very specific, and you're getting their reaction to death. But it's not universally unkind. You can see that Holbein has a lot more sympathy for the common folk. So here we can see the emperor with death kind of tugging on his crown, but we see death in the old man and he's kind of kindly leading him on, which I think is rather nice. Holbein also gives us a deathly alphabet, which is rather lovely. And there's C for cat. Now Holbein's illustrations were turned into wood blocks by a man called Hans Lutzberger, who died in 1526, and he'd only completed 41 of the blocks. And it was only his heirs selling the original blocks which led them to be published in Lyon in 1538. And they were really popular. Between 1538 and 1562, that's only 24 years, there are 11 authorized editions, and many unauthorized editions. And as with anything that's popular, there are copies. So this is Holbein's Death and the Physician. Again, you can see his flask of urine. And here is one of the many copies. And you can see they're almost frame for frame. You know, you wouldn't get away with this with copyright these days. But the Danse Macabre spreads. You get many versions. This is a really beautiful one in Lucerne. It dates, I didn't put the date on this slide. This dates to the mid-17th century. And this is a wooden bridge that crosses the river. And the Dance of Death was painted as a series of panels in the rafters of the bridge. So here we can see a nice little skeleton party going on here. And there's some really beautiful 19th century versions reproducing the images from this. So this is one of them where we can see a bit more clearly what the party looks like. Another one where Death is sneaking up on the huntsman. This is Death and the Herzog, which is a German title somewhere around a duke. And again, in one of these 19th century copies of the illustrations from Lucerne, we can see this illustration of it. And I really love in this version the little bits to fill in the spaces here. These were really intriguing when I was looking through this book. Here's another couple of examples of these little sort of almost kind of sort of marginalia drawings. And you get a whole lot of far more elaborate types of Danse Macabre as you get into the Baroque period. And then you get into the 19th century. So this is Thomas Rawlinson, a British satirist. We're starting to get really into the taking death as satire at this point. So here he is in conversation with Napoleon. And this is just after he was defeated at the Battle of Leipzig. And Thomas Rawlinson went on from this illustration of Napoleon to produce the English Dance of Death, which was in 2 volumes. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. It possibly has one of my favorite Danse Macabre images opposite the title page, which is this one. I mean, it's just fabulous. And he really just gets into the nitty-gritty of just being nasty to everyone in society, basically. So here we have the masquerade, the genealogist, the quack doctor. Obviously, I find this, like working with medical history, I find this particularly interesting. You've got the quack doctor here, and there in the corner, death grinding up the slow poison. And then the one that's possibly a wee bit close to the bone. So this was just after the opening of the catacombs in Paris. Here we have the vision of skulls, where death is showing people around a catacomb. And then you get other versions, which are also really satirical. Death's Doings by R. Dagley. The Romancing the Gothic audience, I'm sure will appreciate this. The poet with death leering over his ode to immortality there. And you can see the words Greece, 1824 at the bottom. So obviously this is Byron. And I really love this one, the hypochondriac. Just look at that little skeleton beastie that's just scuttled down the chimney. But things do become more serious again. And death really becomes tied up with images of war. And then we get into the 20th century, and Simplicissimus was a German satirical magazine, which ran from the 1890s to the 1960s. And this is in 1917. So obviously this is taking the kind of imagery you get in the Dance of Death and applying it to the First World War. And again, this is during the Depression in Germany in the 1920s, hunger and death. And this is almost exactly 100 years ago, and I feel that we're getting to the point where this could be applied to 2020s Britain. And you kind of get, as we go into the 20th century, less of these processions of death and it becoming a much more individual thing. So this is Käthe Kollwitz's Death from a Weaver's Revolt. We see her death peering into this image of abject poverty. And Kollwitz lost her son during the First World War, so this is where we're going to be talking about child death. She starts to go on to use lots of images of death and children. And this is one of the things that you have to see in the Danse Macabre, because, before the modern period, the modern day, infant mortality was far, far higher than we're used to it at the moment. And the chances are, up until relatively recently, if you had multiple children, they were not all going to survive. And sometimes you see this suggested that people were actually indifferent to this, that it's just like, oh yeah, another child gone, that's fine, which is patently bollocks. And I think that one of the things that the Danse Macabre shows us is that people were caring about this. So if we go back to that Dance of Death that I looked at earlier in La Vie de Chez Dieu in France, here we see death taking away a child, but death is covering his face. He doesn't want to frighten the child. And here, death is often depicted with an arrow, but here it's not a point on the end, it's a hand. So there seems to be something much kinder as he's pointing at the infant. So it's showing that death is inevitable and, inexorable, but that doesn't mean to say that's the same as cruel. And as I said, I'm an anatomist. I'm quite interested in the way that these kind of Danse Macabres have formed a dialogue with the way anatomy has been depicted. So we got the Danse Macabres rising in the 15th century. In the 16th century, we get Vesalius's De Fabrica, which is this revolutionary work that changes anatomy in the way that it's depicted with its beautiful, beautiful illustrations. And again, this seems to be very reminiscent of some of the Danse Macabre imagery. We see death holding a skull, and on the plinth we see the words, "Genius lives on, all else is mortal." And here, Bernardino Genga, this seems much more like a conversation that you would get in one of the Dance of Deaths than it does you know, an anatomical illustration. And Frederick Reusch, he produced lots of actual tableaus using fetal skeletons, and they were posed in landscapes that would be made out of bladder stones and bronchi, you know, little bits of human tissue. They're crying into tissues that are made of mesentery. And this is an illustration of one of his tableaus from the time. Again, these seem to be in a dialogue with these ideas of the Danse Macabre. And for a dance, you need music. I've spent quite a lot of time in the Gemmell collection in Glasgow, which has, you know, lots and lots and lots of different versions of the Danse Macabre. And one of the things that is very obvious as you're going through these books is how many instruments there are. So this is from Guy Marchand's Nouvelle Danse Macabre. And here are just a couple of, you know, just random instruments that I found. So very, very common, but you started to get it actually being turned into music with classical composers. I definitely recommend the Camille Saint-Saëns, Benjamin Britten, Mahler, Shostakovich, Schoenberg, and Iron Maiden. And as you get into the end of the 20th century, I think the most popular representation of a conversation between death and the living is with Terry Pratchett. And I just want to finish with this illustration from the Nuremberg Chronicles, which seems almost joyful. And I think the Danse Macabre is there. It's helping us trying to confront something that is fearful for most people, you know. And as today we watch horror films, we make jokes, we do things like that. I think that that's the same going back to the 15th century. And the dance is still going on. In Verges in Spain, they've revived a medieval tradition of including a dance of death as part of Christ's Passion in their Easter parades. And so this is something that you can still see there on Maundy Thursday. So the skeletons are still dancing. And that's where I'm going to stop.